Okay, part two. So now let's talk about why biodiversity is declining around the world. Um, Again, makes humans feel bad. So probably the most important reason why we are seeing a decrease in species diversity is because habitat loss. Why? Most habitat loss is totally, absolutely due to human development, construction zones, us moving into and onto an organism's habitat and taking it over as our own. A lot of species require very specialized habitats. If you think about tiny, like little niche habitats where there's some species of birds that only exist above a certain elevation or altitude in the mountains, there's some species of um, like amphibians that live in fish that only live in aquifers and in caves. So there's some very specialized habitats that we may not even really know much about until we impede upon them and start to take them over. So a species may decline in abundance or become extinct without complete habitat destruction. Here in where we live, there is some areas around San Antonio that they have actually banned construction because it does impact some habitat for some species. And that's very important that we uphold that because even some partial habitat destruction can absolutely lead to a devastating loss in those species numbers. So this picture here is figure 60.2. It is on 664 of your book, and it really shows you how much tree loss has been occurring. The original tree cover versus and then tree gain. Whenever we talk about tree gain, what we're looking at here is if we've been able to restore some forests that we originally had cut down, or planting that is occurring in areas from people's front yards, et cetera, et cetera, in some areas that may not really naturally had much habitat, trees and stuff like that. But so this shows you the green is all the total tree cover. The pink is the tree loss within that, and then some tree gain. And some of that is absolutely good. And then too, some of it is kind of human built and human planting for our own benefit. Another issue that we're having is that exotic species are being transported and moved from one place to another, sometimes accidentally, sometimes absolutely on purpose. And it's a thing, it's a big thing. Every area has their own native species. So there's species that live and innately only live in that one little area. So like here where we are, we have native species of plants, animals, other organisms here that's native to Central South Texas. But then anything that is introduced is called an exotic species, also called an alien species. So exotic species are organisms that were planted, that were brought over to help maybe take care of another problem, like eat something as a predator and those kinds of things. But now, since they may not have natural predators, or they have found a way to like completely take over, because guess what? It's a great environment for them and they don't have competition. So that may lead to them becoming an invasive species. So invasive species are a big, big problem. And we have several of them. I mean, and it impacts all different things. So invasive species could be anything from mussels that attach to the bottoms of boats that move from one body of water to another. Those zebra mussels, they're horrible. Another could possibly be there. I mean, you have wild boars that were introduced, and now that they're taking over. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I'm going to stop there. So, but invasive exotic species are an issue. And again, we've talked about this in the past. We're just bringing it back up because we need to make note of it again. Overharvesting causes declines in populations and species. And overharvesting is not just fishing. It could be hunting. It could be harvesting certain wild crops that, I say wild crops, like berries that you would only find in certain parts of a rainforest, those kinds of things. And if we harvest too many of the berries can't, fall and regrow and germinate and all that kind of stuff, then that's going to disrupt that. So most species, they can absolutely accept to be some kind of harvest, some level of harvesting, but then too, we can also overharvest. So overharvesting would be basically the rate at which we are removing them at a higher rate than they can be replenished or replaced. So in extreme cases, overharvesting can lead to extinction because, maybe we hunted the species to extinction. Like we almost hunted the wild North American bison or buffalo to extinction, and we are trying to help save them, and their numbers are coming up. Plant and animal trade is another issue. If you travel outside the United States, you're not allowed to bring back certain types of vegetation, like fruits, vegetables, all that kind of stuff, back into the country. We don't want to introduce them back here, just in case, you're going to plant that crazy banana. Yeah, no. But there's reasons for it. The Lacey Act helps prohibit interstate shipping of all illegally harvested plants and animals. So that would basically say if somebody were to receive or come into, trap a wild animal that may, especially if it's an endangered species, and then try to sell it on the black market and then transport it, say, from Texas to New Mexico or something like that. Then there's also what we call CITES. It's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And that is basically to help prevent the international trade of threatened plants and animals. So that's what you might get nailed on if you try to bring certain things into the United States. One time when I was in college, I worked at PetSmart. I worked in the fish department. Someone had smuggled in seahorses from, I don't remember, some Caribbean island that they went to. And I was just completely appalled that anybody would even try to do it. And they called asking for help on how to acclimate them to their tank. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And that they were in clear violation of this treaty. In the red list is a worldwide list of threatened species. We talked about what the threatened and most threatened species are. So there are several of them out there, unfortunately. Another bad thing that we can do is pollute the earth. We know this. And pollution can threaten biodiversity because we now know about what these toxic contaminants and these chemicals can do if we are environmentally exposed to them. It could be anything from pesticides to heavy metals to acid rain and all this kind of stuff. Oil spills are a bad one too. Then those toxic contaminants can not only affect us and our health one way or another, but we also talked about how they could be things like endocrine disruptors or neurotoxins, carcinogens, right? We classified those. So those all can be classified, and there's a lot of pollutants that we don't even know are pollutants yet, and we're not sure of how they are impacting species. But we also do know that overnutrition in terms of water can lead to things like those algal blooms and things like that. We can have thermal pollution where it can make the water temperature too high and kill off some of the organisms there and then allow others to flourish, like algae blooms and things like that. And then that can also occur, we're seen issues with icebergs melting. Yeah, bad stuff. So climate change absolutely has the potential to affect species diversity. This is not up for debate. This is fact. But we know that if climate change changes things like temperature, if it changes the amount of rainfall or precipitation, then that could affect not things that just in that area, but worldwide. It could have almost what we call a butterfly effect, a much broader outreaching effect. So some species may be able to respond to changes in the environment. And that's part of that adaptation part of life. However, some cannot. And if they can't, then they're more likely to die, and their numbers will go down, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that was all the bad stuff. Now, how do we fix it? How do we conserve biodiversity? Well, one thing we can do is we can pass laws. We can come up with treaties. We can come to agreements as humanity and say, you know what, this needs to come to a stop. We need to talk about XYZ. How do we prevent this from happening? So in the United States and around the world, we have different acts, provisions, treaties, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to talk about just a few. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act was put into place in the early 70s to help protect declining populations of marine mammals, whales, dolphins, those kinds of organisms. So whenever you see like a can of tuna and it says dolphin safe, it was partially because of this Protection Act. They're not allowed to use certain kinds of nets, trapping purposes to get the tuna, all that kind of stuff. We also try to work on maintaining a good list of those endangered species and threatened species. Then we try to look at legislation and treaties to try to prevent their numbers from declining. We look at ways that we can intervene to try to possibly put them in zoos, breeding programs, things like that, to try to refurbish their habitat. And so there's a bunch of legislation that's going on out there, may just need to be better enforced. We also have the Endangered Species Act, which authorizes the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to determine which species can be listed as threatened or endangered, and what needs to be done to prevent further loss. So you could say no trading of them, no hunting of them, no fishing of them, no, like whenever you go to a national park, you're not allowed to pick the wildflowers, those kinds of things, right? You can't remove things from the parks because they are protected. The Convention on Biological Diversity is an international treaty, and it works to try to not just conserve biodiversity, but try to use it sustainably. So try to use it at a rate that we don't overharvest, that we're not taking too much, right? So we're trying to take enough, but maintain sustainable practices as humans and as we share everything with the earth. Some conservation efforts focus on bits and pieces of ecosystems, and then some work on protecting the entire ecosystem. Now, there's pros and cons to this. So a lot of times we can get human buy-in if we try to protect the aesthetic beauty of an area and we try to protect that cultural service. Then if we can buy people in on that factor of it, then a lot of times, and we can protect a great deal of that ecosystem, and then also protect its regulating services and its other sources as well. And that can kind of help ring in and protect the entire ecosystem and all of its parts. So if we try to protect an entire ecosystem, this may be like a state park, a national park, a national forest, things like that. So what we can do is we can see here that as we have tried to do that, we've added more and more protected land, and not just in the United States, but around the world. And this really has helped to try to protect and increase the habitat, I want to say sanctity, but really the protection of those lands and that water for organisms that are there. All right, the shape, size, and connectedness of protected areas. So we know that island biogeography was really mostly put into place for oceanic islands, obviously island biogeography. But we can also talk about it and apply it to just on land in certain ways as well, because we can apply that that to islands and protected areas in the midst of less hospitable environments, which kind of is an important fact. An example of this is that it is less likely that species can travel among protected areas that are far apart. When a species has been lost from one ecosystem, it will be harder for individuals of that species from other ecosystems to recolonize it. So if there's a series of islands, or it could be, we can almost use this in terms of like in a area like in a forest where that there may be a city dividing parts of the forest too, that we have to find ways for for that species to reach the rest of its kind or to reach the rest of its habitat. So conservationists have to consider those meta populations. A species is more likely to be protected from extinction if it can be rescued by dispersers from a neighboring population. So what does that mean? It means that we are more likely to be able to protect a species and help protect its numbers if we can move some of its inhabitants from one area to another area of that ecosystem. And again, this could be because they're on different islands, or it could begin because maybe there is a river that is, or lake that is now separating one side of it from another. Edge habitat is on another important thing, because this is what kind of really puts the connectedness in there. So edge habitat is when two communities kind of merge upon each other, and it can be a gradual, like showing, like, as a mountain kind of comes down into the foothills, it looks the change is very gradual, or it can be very drastic. Water, land, grassy field, forest. So desert to sea. So there's a lot of instances where that connectedness can be gradual or it could be abrupt. So what biosphere reserves are is it's a protected area, and we try to prevent human impact. So again, we talked about state parks and all this kind of stuff. So they tend to focus on the core zone. So that is like what they're absolutely trying to protect. And then we have a buffer zone. Buffer zone is the area surrounding it to a certain degree, and that would include the core zone, but then the surrounding areas as well, to help us humans can kind of go in there and use it responsibly. And then we also have the transition area, which is typically like, the area right outside the state park, national park, whatever, but it is still monitored, because what if some of the organisms that are in the core zone, buffer zone, reach out into that area, migrate out to that area, and so they need to be able to still observe the organisms there. All right, so chapter 18, a lot of stuff, but also a lot of stuff that we've already talked about. So we're going to use this, and as we move into chapter 19, we're going to talk about how do we try to curb and better prepare our future generations for living on Earth.